Hi, my name is Shoaib, and welcome to Sound and VN 100 Years of BBC and Berlin, an event organized by Humboldt University's Center for British Studies. And today I have here with me via Zoom Mr. Ben Bradshaw. He's an MP from in the city of Exeter. Thank you so much for your time and giving us this opportunity, Mr. Bradshaw, and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
So I will just start by asking about your time, which you spent in Berlin, and also about you worked as the Berlin correspondent for the BBC. What inspired you to become a Berlin correspondent for the BBC, and how did you get started in this field?
Well, I'd always been very interested in Germany. I studied German at school and university, and I'd spent many years in Germany, first through a school exchange, and then I did a year as part of my degree at Freiburg University in the southwest of Germany. I had friends all over both West and East Germany. I had always found Berlin a fascinating city, and German history and culture very rich and very interesting. But completely by chance, when I was working for the BBC in local radio in Exeter, which is now my parliamentary constituency, an old colleague of the BBC who had been the Bonn correspondent had retired down to Devon, and he suggested to me that I apply for this job in Berlin. I thought it was a long shot because I was a local radio reporter and this was a foreign correspondent's job. But what was interesting about it is that it was a job that was attached to the German language service. So you needed to be able to speak broadcastable German in order to get the job. And of course, that narrowed the field down. I applied for the job. I got it, much to my surprise. And at the beginning of 1989, I found myself catapulted into Berlin, which had been a fairly quiet place for the previous 30 years or so since the wall went up. But in the next few months was going to be the center of international news and history in the making, and for some months and years to come.
Mm-hmm. And if I may ask, what did your day to day as a journalist for the BBC look like, and what type of news stories did you cover, and in which language?
Well, we operated in a very different environment technologically there. It's remarkable to think we had no mobile phones, we had no email. So it was all telephone calls. I think I might have had a pager during my time in Berlin, which, if the news desk in London wanted to contact me because of an urgent story or event that had happened in East Germany, then that would go off. But basically, it was about talking to contacts. I inherited some very good contacts in East Berlin and East Germany from my predecessor, but also using the time I had in my first weeks and months in Berlin to meet as many people as possible, talk to people. I would also, of course, read and consume all of the German written and broadcast media to make sure that I was abreast of what was going on. And responding to events. And as I said in my first answer, quite soon after I arrived in the beginning of 1989, things begun to bubble up in East Germany in particular, and the East German people started to get more courageous about going on demonstrations, demanding more freedom and democracy. East Germans were filling up the West German embassies and other institutes all over Central and Eastern Europe as a means to escape to the West. Hungary opened its borders, which meant that East Germans who were allowed to go on holiday to Hungary basically had an open door into the West from there. So there was something really happening almost from the moment I arrived, which meant I didn't really have a lot of time to think about what I was doing. I just had to get out and report it and send my reports back to London, usually reel to reel. We had in those days still reel to reel tape, and sometimes over the telephone, and using the technology that was available to us at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and
I
in
mean,
English and in German.
ah, bo-
I expected when I went that most of my work would be in German because I was the German language correspondent in Berlin, and the role of the German language service was to broadcast primarily to East Germany, but we had quite a few listeners in West Germany as well. But I think because of the nature of the news story and how important the news story became during those months of 1989, I found myself increasingly reporting in English, not just to the BBC, but to English language broadcasters all over the world who didn't have any correspondents or journalists in Berlin. So it was pretty non-stop
Hmm.
from the moment I woke up in the morning till the moment I went to bed at night.
Hmm. I mean, it must have been quite a remarkable time. Can you tell us, can you tell our audience what was your experience like reporting on the fall of the Berlin Wall, and how did the people of Berlin react to the news of the collapse? Like, how was their reaction?
Well, it was a remarkable period. I mean, I was somebody who was involved in news and reporting news on an hourly and daily basis. Uh, Even for me, the pace of events took my breath away. If you were an ordinary member of the public, you would have found it quite hard to keep up with what was going on. Um, and of course, the way in which the Berlin Wall eventually opened on that incredible night in October 1989 was accidental. Nobody expected it to happen when it did. And although I think a lot of people thought that a change was inevitable in East Germany, we had the historic and famous visit from President Gorbachev to take part in the anniversary celebrations for the formation of the GDR when he issued a warning to the then East German regime under Honecker that if they didn't move with the times, times would overtake them. Is a rather crude translation of the Russian that was then translated into German. But even what happened when the wall came down took everybody by surprise. I think on the West Berlin and West German side, um, there was even less expectation and anticipation of such dramatic change. I think the West Germans and the West Berliners, as well, to some extent, had become very comfortable in their new life, in their new world. It was materially comfortable. They had democratic freedoms. They were free to travel. And they didn't really pay too much attention, most of them, to the plight of their cousins in the East. And in fact, some of the reactions you got from West Germany and from West Germans after the wall came down about reunification, it was less than enthusiastic. Um, so I think people had to change their perceptions very, very quickly, deep-seated perceptions and prejudices in both East and West, in order to keep up with events. And that growing together in many ways is still going on. If you look at the economic differential that still exists between East and West Germany, it's still quite dramatic. But on the other hand, a remarkable achievement given the enormity of the task that Germany had to undertake to bring those two countries back together again.
And also the quality in football as well, in Bundesliga as well. There are hardly two teams from the East Germany. I think it's Union
Wow.
and Hertha, and the rest is like totally dominated by the West Germany.
Well, you know more about football than I do, but I suspect that's also a symptom of the economics of the two Germanys, because as we know, football these days, a lot of it's about money.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And okay, moving on. Can you tell us like how did you and the BBC approach the coverage of the fall of the wall, and what were some of the unique challenges that you faced during that time?
Well, I think yes, I think that my answer to that leads on from where I finished the last answer, which is that I think because as a Brit, I was one step removed from events in Germany and German history. I would like to think it helped make us a little bit more objective about what was going on, and more open to the prospect of German unification than perhaps either the East or West German political class, or a lot of the political class, were. Um, Although famously Mrs. Thatcher was very against German unification, that wasn't the widespread view in Britain or in the West generally. I mean, the widespread view was that this was something that was natural to happen. that the division of Europe after the Second World War had been a terrible thing, and had condemned the countries of Central and Eastern Europe to live under autocratic rule and very, very badly performing economies for many years. So I think I felt I could cover the politics around unification with less of an agenda. It's strange, but the West Germans, in a way, had, as I said earlier, had reconciled themselves to the post-war settlement almost as a price of their complicity in, or their historic complicity in Hitler's crimes, and saw the division of their country as something that should not be questioned. Forgetting, of course, though, that it was all right for them because they were on the side of the Iron Curtain that probably most people would have chosen to be on, and it was the East Germans who had really, for the previous few decades, paid the price of the Nazi crimes and lived under communism and had no choice in that. So, I think it was easier in a way for somebody from a third country to have a more objective perspective on all of that and to report it accordingly. I mean, the challenges, there weren't. I mean, the only challenges that we really faced, obviously, we had the technological challenges that we faced then, but we didn't know any different. And because I had trained in local radio, I was quite used to working under a lot of pressure time-wise and having to do a lot of my own editing and work really as a single operator, which you did as a radio reporter. The main challenges apart from that were simply the capacity to keep up with what was going on. There were so many potential stories that you could cover. There was insatiable appetite, not just from the BBC, but other English language broadcasters around the world for stories. And the other thing, of course, was until the fall of the East German regime, I was restricted in some ways as to what I could do in East Germany. I mean, I had free reign within Berlin as an occupied city under the four powers. But if I wanted to report or do journalism outside East Berlin in East Germany, I used to have to ask for permission each time. I mean, that didn't last for very long. I mean, by the time the wall came down, as we know, the East German security services were pretty ineffective, and I think they probably felt that the game was up. So they weren't really trying to enforce those rules very hard anymore. I mean, I did a lot of journalistic work, recording and interviewing of vox pops, of ordinary people in the streets in East Berlin, which officially, I should have asked the East German authorities for permission to, but I mean, I was never going to, because they would not have given it, and I didn't really have any fear that anything would happen to me. So, but those were the only real challenges apart from the obvious ones of covering such a big news story 24/7.
Okay, you just mentioned the historical complicity of this country. We will get to that later on, but I want to ask, you just mentioned that there was so much happening at that time. As a journalist, how did you decide which stories to cover in Berlin, and what factors did you consider when choosing to cover the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, I mean, my job first and foremost, given the enormity of the news events, was to cover the news, and there was plenty of news, like things that happened, that would be leading the bulletins on a daily basis. But then in the background to that, there were some fascinating kind of human interest type stories. I mean, I'd just give you a couple of examples. One was the discovery of lots of wonderful works of art and cultural artifacts that people thought had disappeared, but had been squirreled away and were rediscovered and then put on display. The other was the whole issue around the restitution of people's property rights, and particularly Jewish people's property rights, because of course, although if you had been Jewish and your family had lost property or suffered as a result of the Nazis, in West Berlin and West Germany, you had always been entitled to that restitution and compensation. That had not been the case in the East. So you had a whole new wave of generation of Jews and their descendants who went through claims and things like that. A third example was the discovery of a number of retired Baader-Meinhof terrorists on East German soil, which was kind of mind-blowing, I think, to most people. There'd been rumors during the period of the Baader-Meinhof Rote Armee Fraktion terrorist campaign in West Germany that they had been supported and funded by the communist regime of East Germany. But those rumors had never actually been stood up. But then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to find some of these ex-terrorists working as school assistants or plumbers in obscure provincial East German towns and cities under new identities was one of the most astonishing things. So there was as well as the kind of daily news, there were a lot of very interesting stories beneath the news that I covered to help kind of reflect the enormity of these events and the impact that they were having, not just on people's lives in East and West Germany and East and West Berlin, but further afield as well.
Mm-hmm. And earlier you mentioned about the historical complexity of this country. I wanted to ask, like, how important do you think the role of BBC has been in the world's understanding of Germany's past?
Well, obviously, I mean, during the Second World War and the Nazi period in particular, the role of the BBC was huge because radio was one of the few ways in which people could get information into their homes, direct ways, and for most of the Second World War, there was no free media broadcasting in Nazi-occupied Europe, so or indeed Soviet-occupied Europe. So we know from historical documentation how important the BBC was for people in those countries who wanted to hear the truth about what was happening. And I think, certainly when it comes to Eastern Europe after the war, the importance of that role carried on, and the importance of the role that the BBC played globally in bringing news and information, particularly to countries where access to such information is restricted. How much that played in the end. What was very interesting, I thought, about the role that the BBC played, that I learned from the recent event that the Humboldt University's British Studies Centre laid on in Berlin, was, for example, things that I hadn't really been aware of, like the role of well-known BBC disc jockeys in the 1970s and 80s, like John Peel, who was a very well-known disc jockey here. He was a pioneer of contemporary music, rock music. His program apparently was one of the most listened to radio program in East Germany for many, many years, and it led to the development of a unique East German punk culture, for example. So I think the BBC's role was not just around news and information, but it was also around culture. And of course, all of this stuff is what comes together under the umbrella of soft power. And I think there's no doubt that the role of soft power, I mean, in the end, can be hugely important. But as we know from the time it took, it's it's not enough on its own to really change the course of history. We needed the internal contradictions of the Soviet communist system to kind of fall apart, really, and for the drive for reform and democratization from within to be strong enough, really, until those countries all, like a pack of cards, really, in 1989 and the years afterwards, moved towards democracy.
Hmm. I mean, you reported for BBC at that time. What do you think? Like, what role your BBC report played, like on the fall of Berlin, and also like in shaping the world's view of Berlin and its people?
Um, well, I don't really know, because as a journalist, you never really know the impact of your reporting. I mean, I hope that through my reporting, I managed to convey the sense of um, uh, you know incredulity and amazement and joy, but also bewilderment about uh, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the events that followed. Um, the incredible challenges that it produced and needed to be overcome. And if I was ever trying to do anything, I mean, I've always had a great deal of respect and sympathy for modern Germany. I think post-war, uh, after the horrors of two world wars and the Nazi dictatorship, um, Germans have developed what I consider to be a model democracy in many ways. Self critical, open, hugely economically successful, liberal, all the things that all the kind of things that we in Britain have often aspired to and believed are important. And so all of my reporting from Berlin, I hope, was kind of founded on that essential sympathy, and which I think was quite important, because there was a residual, and you saw this in Mrs. Thatcher's
Hmm.
response to the Berlin Wall. There was a residual kind of anti-German prejudice in Britain. Not so much, I don't think, in the rest of the English-speaking world, but in Britain, uh, some of that came back to the fore during the whole Brexit debate, didn't it? So yes, I mean, I tried my best to be objective and fair, but also to convey to a British audience that a modern, strong, democratic Germany was not a bad thing. In fact, it was a good thing. It was a good thing, and it was a country with which Britain had a lot in common and would do very well to ally itself with
Yeah.
closely.
Like, how has your experience reporting for the BBC influenced your perspective on the role of media in shaping public opinion and promoting understanding between cultures and nations?
Well, it's what it has done is it's strengthened my belief in the importance of uh, a free, democratic broadcast media, which within a public service regulated environment. And if you look at what's happened since the development of social media and what's happened in the United States since they removed their regulatory framework on the broadcast media, I'm not sure that the results have been beneficial, or for the United States, or healthy for its democracy. And when it is so easy for populists and demagogues to spread falsehood or hatred or division or lies, and you don't have a strong public service broadcast media that is committed to objectivity and fairness and telling the truth, that is perilous for the democratic world. So I think in many ways, in the current and modern media environment, organizations like the BBC's role is more important than ever, because they're the only anchor that we have to anchor us in any kind of sense of reality. It's terrifying if you look at how many people rely on Facebook for their information, or the social media, and how easy it is now for conspiracy theories to take hold, and how the current media landscape seems to have strengthened the extremes at the cost of the rational, problem-solving, boring center. So, yeah, I think that's probably the thing that has stayed with me most. And obviously, at the time, it was very acute because, many people in East Germany and former Eastern Europe didn't have access to free information. But I think the problem now is a slightly different one, certainly in the democratic world. And the fact that, there are, I think for the first time for many years now, there's a sort of democratic index, isn't there? International Democratic Index. And for the first time after decades of that expanding, it's now growing smaller again. So I think it's something we need to be very, very alert to.
I mean, audiences or like people in general, like they are usually the consumer of the information. But like you have been on the other side, like as a journalist, like how has your experience as a BBC journalist has shaped your understanding of global politics and international relations, and also like how has it informed your current views on issues such as foreign policy and international cooperation?
Well, I think probably, that's a huge question, but I think in brief, it's helped inform my views on the essential human desire for freedom of expression and autonomy, but also the sense that the problems that the globe faces today are only problems that can be resolved through international cooperation and cross border working, not by some kind of proto nationalism, which is just a dead end. Basically, if we're going to address the climate crisis or the refugee crisis and all the other huge global challenges we face, we're not going to be able to do those by shutting ourselves in behind our own borders and hoping they go away, because they won't, and sooner or later they'll wash up on our borders anyway. So, yeah, I think probably those two things.
Okay, moving on. I would like to ask, like, in your opinion, how has the BBC evolved since you first started reporting for them? And what are some of the most significant changes, if I may ask, that you have witnessed?
I don't think the BBC has essentially changed in its fundamentals an awful lot. I mean, it's obviously had to move with the times, it's had to modernize in terms of it's the content it provides. It's had periodic run-ins with the British government over issues. I think I think the problem there has not so much been the BBC, but it's been the behaviour of governments and how governments here have managed their relationship with the BBC. And there are a number of reforms I would like to see. I think to secure the BBC's future and independent status as a result of those. Obviously, it's moved into digital. It's run down its language services, which in some ways is a shame, but in some ways is inevitable. And it's faced a lot more competition from other global media actors, which has been a challenge for it, but actually it's forced it to probably improve its product. But it's and there are but that there is So I think those are the things probably that I would say about it. But I think in its essence, it's still what it was, and it still commands very significant popular support in the United Kingdom, and is probably still respected around the world as a global international broadcaster. Perhaps not quite to the same extent that it was in the past, but when I was a Foreign Office minister, I would often find my husband used to work for BBC World. The fact that world leaders would agree to be interviewed by BBC World, I think shows the effectiveness of its reach and how much those global leaders and national statespeople rate its reach as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Lastly, I would like to ask, how do you see the future of BBC in Germany evolving in the coming years?
Well, I think there'll always be a role for an English language news service in Germany. I mean, I suspect quite a lot of the people who were listening to the BBC World Service when I was correspondent there were doing so in order to try to improve their English as much as to listen to the news. And it's often useful. It's a very good way of improving your English understanding. It's a good way of seeing another country's perspective on your country. I mean, the role is obviously different now, but there's still a lot of content. There's still a lot of BBC content that Germans enjoy as well. They may not be viewing it on the traditional BBC platforms, but they may be streaming it or whatever. So I think there's still a role for the BBC, but that will depend on its survival, the survival of its funding model, and ongoing commitment and support, not just of British parliaments, but also of the British public. And those things are never guaranteed, which is why, as I say, I think the governance and funding model for the BBC probably needs to be reviewed to bring it up to date with where we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, at this point, I have to end our podcast because of the time constraint. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us your time and also for this opportunity. Thank you so much, Mr. Bradshaw. And
you're very welcome. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.